Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming to the training today on compassion fatigue and secondary trauma, part 2. If that's what you're here for, then you're in the right place. My name is Mark Mora. I work for Homebase. Homebase is a nonprofit that provides technical assistance and support to COCs across the nation, including in Tulsa, where we're contracted by Housing Solutions. So technically, hosting the training today is Housing Solutions. Just off the bat, know that we are recording the session today. So the recording already started. We will make the recording available shortly after the training. It will be available on the COC website. Just note that the chat box will not be recorded. And so the training is, again, today, part 2. Part 1 was on March 30th. And before I pass it over to our wonderful trainer, Dmitry, I just want to go over a couple tech items. So live transcript is available. If you want to use that, you go down to the toolbar on Zoom and then hit live transcript. You could also hit that if for whatever reason live transcript is on at the moment and you want to turn it off. You can just hit hide transcript or hide text. And then, of course, everyone is muted. You can use the chat box to ask questions. There will be times during the training, I'm sure where Dmitry will open it up and allow you to ask questions and come off mute. But know that I'm monitoring the chat, or both of us are monitoring the chat box. So if your question is in there and it's not addressed right away, we'll make sure that it gets addressed eventually. And also, if you have any tech issues, you can direct message me, or if for whatever reason you get kicked off and have trouble getting in, you can always email me at mark@homebasecc.org. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and pass it over to Dmitry Vulfovich, who will lead the training today.
Well, hello, everybody. It's great to be back. I'm excited to do this part 2. I don't know if many of you have, if everyone here had already been with me for the first one. Several times I've taught the part 1. So I'm assuming that many of you have already been acquainted with me or to some degree, because this is going to be sort of an continuation of the things that I've been talking about. So so keep that in mind. Although I do think that if you are seeing me for the first time, you can still make sense of it regardless. So, but with any case, I'll go ahead and get started. So my name is Dmitry Vulfovich. I'm a psychotherapist and clinical director in San Jose, California. I specialize in trauma and somatic psychology, which is sort of like a body-oriented approach. And is that sound from the people entering the room?
Can you hear that?
Yeah. I don't know if it's possible to take that off.
Yeah, let me see if I can turn that off. Yeah, that's the sound of people entering the room.
Thanks. So yeah. And I kind of specialize in an experiential psychotherapy, which kind of involves sort of in the moment experiences, and more of that than talking. So I'll be kind of giving you some kind of tips and wisdoms that I've developed throughout the years with regards to compassion fatigue and kind of how to thrive in the helping profession. So you can text in if you have any questions throughout. I'll try to respond to them if I can, so to make it more relevant and engaging with the training. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and start the share screen, and we can go from there. All right, so here we go. So So I want to start off today with this little quote. I don't know who said it, but it's the message is the highest form of human intelligence is to observe yourself without judgment. You know, I think part of a big chunk of what I'm going to be talking to you about today is, you know, in Buddhist psychology, there's something called the first and second arrow, and there's actually maybe 3 or 4 arrows total, but it's basically this idea that the first arrow is something happening to you in life, like something difficult, like some kind of adversity, something that's uncomfortable or hurtful that would happen to you, like a breakup or something happen at work or some difficult circumstance. That's the first arrow. And the second arrow is the story you tell yourself, or the judgment you give yourself, or the suffering you accrue on top of what happened initially. And so basically, we want to look at how we're responding to events, and because the second arrow is the one that's self-inflicted, right? So the first arrow is shot at you from the outside, and then the second arrow is the one you sort of dagger in yourself. So the key to kind of thriving in the helping profession or helping people in life in general is to maintain a certain non-judgmental observer stance for yourself, so that you don't accrue any additional suffering on top of what's already happening, by taking a look at how you're relating to your own judgments towards yourself. Okay. So, and we can get into more about that, but that's the second arrow, the wisdom of the second arrow idea. If you have any questions, feel free to ask about that. Let's see. So I'm going to move on. So the first thing I want to invite you to start thinking about is, so this idea of caring for yourself caring for others starts with caring for yourself. A lot of people naturally think that, that to love when to love means to love somebody else. And it's kind of, we're not really taught about how to inquire about our relationship with ourselves. So some preliminary questions that I want to ask you is, what is your relationship with yourself? Meaning, like, do you like yourself? How do you talk to yourself inside? Are you ever mean to yourself? Do you tell yourself things like you're stupid or you're dumb, or or you're not good enough, or things like that, kind of in the background, and that perhaps you don't acknowledge. And also, how well do you understand yourself? How well do you understand and know, like, why do you do the things that you do, and do you stop to wonder about yourself? And another question is, do you need to forgive yourself about something? Like, are you still kind of hounding yourself for something that had happened in the past, that's sort of like an extra weight that you're carrying around, like a bag of rocks or something, maybe weighing you down? And also another question is, how is self-love considered in your culture? Because there's that cultural component of it too that's important, because I know that in some cultures, some of my students, particularly like in the East, like Asian cultures, it's sometimes very awkward to even say I love you to yourself, because it's not something that is ever practiced, because of a certain sense of modesty and collective customs of service and loyalty to others and the family and the community. And so it's a completely foreign thing. It's a Western kind of idea, really, to consider, my relationship to myself. So, for some people, this may be a little bit more difficult than for others. So you may have to kind of work through this resistance to considering some kind of affinity for yourself, or even giving yourself permission to have those feelings towards yourself. So yeah, and let me know if there's any thoughts immediately from these questions, because I do want to keep this engaging. So yeah, and if it comes to you, you can chat in as you go, and the next thing I want to talk about. So these are some questions to start thinking about. But what I want you to start thinking about also is, as we go into this training, is that what I want to inspire in you, or invite you to kind of consider, is that each one of us really has the capacity to hold space for many different processes and many different feelings simultaneously. We kind of are multidimensional, and so it's completely normal and healthy to have an entire complex of feelings. For instance, like you can hate yourself and love yourself and be guilty and be proud. You can have like an entire intricate system of ways that you relate to yourself, and it doesn't mean that it's wrong. And but the idea is we want to be able to see and hold space for everything, for multiple things at once. And so one of the things that I want to start off with is to ask, well, the question is, can you be both whole and need improvement at the same time? Like, can you consider that, like, well, I've made it this far and I've done a lot of good things, and I think I'm in some senses pretty good with myself, and I love myself, and I'm pretty whole, or I'm whole enough, and at the same time I could make improvements, and consider that maybe perhaps those are not mutually exclusive, like that there could be space for both. And that's that intelligence, that's that non-judgmental observation of, because I think sometimes we have this tendency to swing into these extremes, like either I really suck horribly and I what's wrong with me, or this more kind of inflated sense of oh, I'm wonderful and I'm the best, I'm killing it, but a more realistic and more intelligent perspective is that well, yeah, I'm kind of both, and let me be with both, so that I can be much more refined in knowing and understanding myself. And that's kind of what I want to invite. That's sort of the basis of one of the major tenets of today is looking at that, is how to hold space for yourself in all the different ways that you show up in for yourself. We have a comment here, having a kid, from Christy. Having a kid at 3.5 years old definitely makes me think of these more due to wanting to model self-love and loving behaviors towards myself and others for the benefit of my kid. Very cool when I see her model it back, benefit to me as well. Yeah. Well, kudos to you, Christy. That's awesome. I think maybe collectively we're crawling out of a difficult, dark age of trauma from the generations in the past, and I don't think any of us had people my age and older and continuous, even kids now. But I think that I think that there's a movement towards kind of coming out of this traumatized, kind of a collective traumatizing pattern with kids growing up you know, even in subtle ways, you know, not being allowed to have their feelings, or being told not to get angry or not to get sad, or a very critical kind of, even not to say abusive, but just kind of critical parenting style. I think a lot of us grew up with difficulty trying to figure out who we are as kids. And so I think that if you do have kids and you have the wherewithal to be more introspective in yourself and actually think about, okay, like what am I modeling? What is my relationship to myself, and what kind of example is that for my kid? Like, how would I want my kid to think about themselves? And then how do I want to be towards myself to show them how to do that? So I think that's very awesome that you are looking at that. And another one is Tina. I think as humans, we tend to go to extremes, but not on purpose. We think we are defined by things. So when we fail, it's a failure of who we are and not a failure of that one thing that we're not good at yet. Exactly. Yeah, Tina, I think that's true. And I think that that's what we want to move away from, is sort of this reactive pendulum of reflex, like, oh, this bad thing happened. Oh, that means I'm a total horrible person. And really like letting yourself kind of be thrown at the wind by circumstances, and not being able to just be still and notice, okay, well, that didn't work out, and I feel some shame or regret about that, but let me just hold space for myself and just kind of be with it, and not create this like intense story about how horrible I am. And that's exactly what I want to invite you guys to consider to start doing. One really cool thing, let's see, Catherine, I've always strived to be self-aware, but that makes it difficult for me to believe in myself. It seems hold me back. Yeah. So let me show you. Let me start with something that might help off the bat. This next. So what do you call this? An acronym, or when you have? So this, it's acronym. Yeah. So HUFF. So huff. One easy way to remember this is, I don't know if you're kind of more of the hippie from the older generation, you might remember Puff the Magic Dragon, Live by the Sea. It's kind of a goofy thing, but if that helps you to remember it, it's huff instead of puff. Or maybe Three Little Pigs, like huff, huff, and I'll blow the house down. So huff is my teacher, Donna Hadlock. He created this acronym, which I really love, and it stands for Hold Unconditional Fascination Forever. And it, I mean, I'm sure you've heard of unconditional love from, like, you know, Rogerian, Carl Rogers psychology and stuff like that. But this is a little bit a different twist on it. So this is, it speaks to how to hold yourself, right? So it's how to be with yourself unconditionally, but being fascinated with yourself. So what that means is that you can be fascinated in the face of anything, right? So remember, fascination isn't like a pro-positive thing. Like, people are not only fascinated towards good things. You can also be fascinated towards, like, I don't know, a car accident or something. Like if you see something on the street and you're like, oh, wow, fascinating. Look how that happened. Or look how that house burned down. Or fascination is just a general fascination. It's not like only towards good things. And so what you want to do is you want to stay fascinated unconditionally towards yourself in whatever experience you're having. So you can stay fascinated in the face of your own sadness. You can stay fascinated in the face of your own anger or regret or shame or anxiousness or depression. as well as the good things too. Like you can stay fascinated in your own sense of joy or happiness. But the idea is that you're unconditionally fascinated forever towards yourself. And this is a sort of a template for how to be how to set an attitude within yourself that's healthy. Because we don't want to push and if you remember from the previous trainings we had, we want to allow our feelings, right? We don't want to push the sadness away because that's unhealthy. But we also don't want to like sort of dwell in negative feelings. So the idea is we want to find a relationship to those feelings in a way that is healthy. And fascination is one of the probably the healthiest attitudes or temperaments to keep, because it's spacious, it's curious, it's inquisitive, it's open-minded, and so just if you can remember that, hold unconditional fascination forever, it can help you to stay open in the face of whatever difficulties you're experiencing. Christy says, one of my professors always encouraged us to get curious. If we feel something uncomfortable, if we catch ourselves being judgmental, get curious about that and avoid shame or expectation that we are supposed to always be perfect. Get curious about others, an environment, whatever it is. Dr. Diane McMillan said something to that effect. Yeah, that's exactly what it is. And that goes with that initial statement about being non-judgmental. Because if you think about it, you're sort of like nurturing yourself too, right? Because you're not judging, and that judgment, it kind of drags you down. So the more fascinated you are towards yourself and others, the more kind of you're nurturing yourself with a good vibe, you know, like you're kind of like, oh, interesting. Like, you know, when I sit with clients sometimes, and here's how you can particularly how it's helpful in the helping profession, which is really a golden nugget if you could remember this. When you're sitting with a client or anybody that you're helping, a homeless person or not, if you can find a way to stay fascinated with them, you will nurture yourself in the experience. So for instance, I'll give you an example. Let's say that you're sitting with a client that is like a murderer, child molester, serial killer, you name it. Horrible by standards of society, not a good person. If you're sitting with them and you're thinking to yourself, oh my God, this person is disgusting. I just can't even. This is so horrible. That may be true, but for you, it doesn't serve you to be that way, because you're helping them. You're trying to do a community service to support them in some way, or change them, or help them to transform, or whatever. And so if you're in that attitude of lament or hatred towards that situation or that person, you're kind of bogging yourself down, and you're not really being of service to them. So what helps is just to find a way to stay fascinated. So I might tell myself a story, something like, wow, like human nature is so interesting. How fascinating is it that, you know, humans can get so traumatized and so hurt and so psychologically damaged that they can commit like these crimes. How interesting. Like how fascinating is like human nature and life that these disorders arise. And if I could use that situation to be interested in human nature and life and psychology, then that event to me is more like of a, you know, a journey of like discovering about life. And then I don't have to bog myself down. So it's all a matter of how I want to perceive it. If I can get creative enough to see the situation as one that is fascinating, then I will nurture myself because my experience then becomes interesting, right? Like, oh, interesting. Wow, human disease, human pathology, that's so interesting. Whereas if I start to judge, then I actually bog myself down. So it's really a self-serving technique to stay fascinated. And if I stay fascinated with my clients, then my day is much lighter, and my day is much more impactful too, because my vibe is high, my vibe is more uplifted. So that's what you want to try to do. Okay. Tina says, I totally understand the concept now. I practice this all the time using motivational interviewing. It has benefited me so much in gathering needed information, developing such a respect for people and their journeys. Right. All right, let's move on. So let's try something together as an experiential. I want you to grab both hands. You can make them into fists, or you can hold them out. But I want you to close your eyes for a moment. And in one hand, I want you to imagine that you're holding wholeness. And on the other hand, you're holding improvement. Okay? And really hold your hands so you can feel them. And try to just imagine that what you are is the greater space, a greater bubble that encompasses these two fists, and see what it's like for a moment to hold space for both. On the one hand, wholeness, your own completeness, and then on the other hand, a certain sense of, I could improve. Not in any particular reason, but just the concept, kind of bare bones, and see if you could just take a moment to feel what it's like to hold both of those at the same time. And just notice what that's like, if that feels a bit different or more spacious. Just give you another moment to just stay with that for a moment. Yeah. You can start to come back. If anybody has any feedback for that, but I certainly encourage you to try that when you're kind of divided or you have multiple feelings or thoughts. You can even try with one of your clients if they have like, oh, I feel this way, but I also feel that way. Oh, let's just hold both. Let's be with both. And so this is an invitation for the idea of holding space for all of you, and not swinging to having to choose one or identify with one. There can be space for both. All right.
This is something that was pretty comfortable actually for me. One of the things that one of my mentors taught me a long time ago was being able to hold two things in tension. And so I got a bunch of the little and symbols around my house just to remind me of that. You can be in one place and another place at the same time, and it's okay to hold those things and learn to be comfortable in the tension of both of those things being true.
That's right. It's beautiful. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think it's absolutely important, because I think the problem with human nature is that we like to, we conveniently like to think that, we are one thing. Like, you look up to somebody, right? Like Martin Luther King or somebody like that, or Gandhi, and it feels great to just be like, okay, he's a great person. and I'm just going to pack that away in my little box inside my head and think, oh, that's great. I can just rely on that. But everybody has their own blind spots and, you know, things that are unsavory. And as uncomfortable as it is, we do need to get comfortable with it. Like you said, we need to get comfortable with other people being dynamic and ourselves being dynamic. So, yep. We are dynamic. We're not one thing. All right. So let's move on. And I like that you guys are participating. So if you need to jump in, I welcome that, because I want to make this more relevant to you, not just a lecture. So okay, so we got this. We covered this idea of being kind of holding space for multiple parts of us, and then I want to also move into now this idea of layers of suffering. And so I'll give you. This starts with like a scenario, and it says if you wake up in the morning and you feel anxious. A lot of times people, when something happens, they feel depressed or anxious or whatever. You may be tempted to compound the anxiety with shame, pity, judgment, hopelessness, fear, loathing, hatred, reasons, explanations. And so what happens is, best way to explain it is like, for instance, let's say I'm going to use this object as my anxiety when I feel it. Okay, what happens is a lot of times when you feel something uncomfortable, you have an immediate reaction, maybe like a shame or a story like, well, why do I always feel this way? And so when that happens, that anxiety gets not covered, but layered with another component, which is like shame. And if you stay with that, sometimes you'll add more. So then it'll be, what's wrong with me? Judgment. So then you have another third layer. And then you may have something else like, oh, it's always going to be this way. Hopelessness, you know? And so, and if you keep going like that, you have a lot more than you started with. You have the initial uncomfortable sensation of anxiety, which may be some kind of like tense sensation in your chest or whatever, which you started out with. But then you start to have a compounded layering of these arrows, second arrow, third arrow, fourth arrow, all these compounded elements. And that really makes it much worse, because it's almost self-perpetuated, really, because each of those layers is doing its own layer of damage, right? Or its own layer of psychophysical dis-ease. It's contributing to unhealthy elements to your body and your mind. And so it's important to keep an eye on how you're holding your experiences, how you're holding your anxiety or depression, however uncomfortable it is, because that compounded process is, maybe that's what depression is, because you kind of depress it with layers of many other things. So it's important for that reason to learn to be watchful and non-judgmental about that initial experience. So if you wake up in the morning, instead of having a reaction to the anxiety, is to learn to be like, okay, I'm anxious right now. Let me learn to just take a deep breath and let me just attend. Let me just watch this anxiety. Now, when I tell this to people, they initially they think, well, why would I want to hold space? You know, I don't like it. And my answer to that is, it's like, yeah, I get it, you know, and nobody likes to be uncomfortable. But the problem is aversion and shame and pity and judgment and all these reactionary feelings towards that doesn't help. It doesn't get rid of it. It doesn't do anything to benefit you. So although holding space and being fascinated and allowing of those uncomfortable feelings feels kind of counterintuitive, like why would I want to hold space or like my anxiety? It's, you know, I don't like it. Yeah, and that makes sense, but the other alternative is far worse. Far worse. So if you don't want to suffer, you have to kind of lean in to this tender, uncomfortable sensation, and that is the way out. Because the way out is through. You have to hold space for that feeling, to just be there. And here's an example of what I'm talking about. And this is a quote by Bruce Lipton. He says, "The moment you change your perception is the moment you rewrite the chemistry of your body." Right? Because here's an experience, right? The bee. Now that could be anything, right? And it could be a bee, it could be feeling of anxiety, it could be sadness, it could be an external event, it could be an internal event. But you see how whatever the person, how they hold space for that is determining. And see how at the bottom there's these on the body, there's these kind of little chemicals, and these are the like kind of different hormones maybe, or stress. But that's altering the perception of and the chemistry of the body. So how the person holds space for that experience is going to change how they experience it and how their body is going to take it. But it could be the same event, right? Does that make sense so far? So, yeah. So it's a paradoxical invitation to really have a loving awareness towards yourself. Okay. And going back, and I think we talked about this pretty in depth in the first segment, but going back to the somatic, this layering that I'm talking about, the dangerous thing about kind of these compounded reactions that we have towards uncomfortable feelings is that every thought creates a sensation. So every time you have a new judgment about yourself, that new judgment creates unhealthy hormones. So when you have negative judgmental thoughts towards yourself, your body over time sort of secretes cortisol and adrenaline. These are the sort of the stress hormones that are really necessary for getting yourself out of difficult situations. These are normal hormones that in moderation are helpful to deal with stress, right? If I was to stress you right now, if I was to threaten you, your body would flare up with cortisol and adrenaline, and it's necessary if you're trying to get out of a difficult situation. But if it's something that's happening to you consistently, and you're stressed out a lot, what happens is it leads to immunosuppression. Now, immunosuppression is basically your body is so flooded with these kind of stress hormones that it doesn't have enough time or capacity to or ease to kind of feed your body with the natural immunity boosting kind of components that it naturally would. And so what happens is that over time, if your immunity is compromised due to stress, your body will look for the weakest link in the body. So meaning the weakest link is that where your body is most, where the go-to place where you usually get sick. Like if you have stomach aches a lot, or headaches, or other issues, heart problems, blood pressure, hypertension, and you will get sick in the normal areas where you get sick when you don't have enough immunity. And so that's why people who are stressed out get sick more often, and then over time could also develop more serious conditions like ulcers and cancer and other heart problems, because their cortisol is depleted. Their cortisol is so used up, because the cortisol is also an anti-inflammatory. I don't want to get too into this, but cortisol, interestingly enough, the cortisol is also it's an anti-inflammatory. Like if you ever have people who have issues, a lot of issues that people have, like asthma or like even blood pressure, hypertension, or things like that. A lot of basic diseases. The medication or the cure is actually a kind of a generic form of cortisol. So, and what they're saying now is that the doctors are saying that the reason why a lot of diseases require a generic cortisol to be taken in is because they've stressed out all their cortisol. So if you do all the stressing out most of your life, your body actually runs out of that cortisol, and then you need to take it as a medication form to deal with asthma or other problems that's related to inflammation. So anyways, I don't want to kind of get too into this, but just keep in mind that the stress does lead to disease. So yeah. Let me know if you have any questions about this. I can elaborate. I guess I'll move on. So this is a little chart that I created that helps to understand how this process works. I call this the cycle of misery. So how it works is that, remember how I just explained that the negative judgments, they create stress hormones and kind of physical disease. Well, that is, of course, on a long-term basis, this is what happens. But on a more immediate level, you can see it as like this. So see how here it says thoughts and stories? I group thoughts with stories because it's the same thing. Like you can have, thoughts are not like, set in stone, right? They're like stories, like, okay, like judgment, stories, thoughts, they're all kind of similar in the sense that they're not, they're trivial. They're up to interpretation. So anyways, so you have thoughts and stories, and every time you have a thought and story, you see how this arrow moves this way, it creates an immediate sensation or feeling. Okay, so any thought you're having, like right now, whatever you're thinking right now as you hear me talk, there is some kind of physiological response to that thought. Now, however subtle, it doesn't mean that it has to be egregiously noticeable, but there's a consistent feedback from every immediate thought you're having into a physiological reaction consistently every moment, probably every half of a millisecond or something. There's a consistent feedback happening. Well, what I just explained to you about, like, you know, waking up with anxiety and then having a negative story about it, right? Like having a judgmental story. Oh, you know, what's wrong with me, or something like that. Well, let's say you thought to yourself, what's wrong with me? Then when you think that, that creates a sensation. Now, when you judge yourself, you may have an entire cascade of sensations. You may feel fatigued. You may feel sad. You may feel heavy in the chest. You may feel jittery. You may feel, I don't know, heart pounding. You know, like there's whatever. There could be an entire like complex of physiological sensations as a result of telling yourself, "What's wrong with me?" Okay, so that's the sensation and feeling component of that thought. And then what happens is, most of the time, when you feel that fatigue or tension as a result of that negative judgment, what happens is, most of the time, is that people will go back and reiterate that thought with a follow-up thought. I'm always going to be like this. I'm not good enough, or whatever. So it's a reiteration of that thought. And then that negative thought goes back and reinforces those sensations that you just had felt. So that fatigue, that tension in the chest, or whatever it was. And so that becomes a reinforcement, or a kind of a holding pattern of those sensations. And then it just goes like, keep going like that, so that you continue to reinforce those thoughts of negative judgment. And then those sensations become more apparent, more chronic, or more of a pattern. And then this is how, like, depression and mental health issues kind of more or less in a nutshell reoccur, because of these thoughts and stories that are re-rendering the sensation. Because here's the thing, and here's the kind of the magic of this somatic psychology, is that the sensations, they can't really exist without the thoughts, because they are created by the thoughts. Another way to look at it is like a campfire with logs. The campfire cannot live without logs, right? You have to keep throwing them. And so that's how you want to think about it. The thoughts and stories are the logs, and then the sensations and feelings is the fire. And so here's the next question, and I'm hoping somebody can answer. What do you do with a campfire that you don't want to burn anymore?
Pour water on it.
Okay, let's say you don't have any water.
Smother it. Like dirt. I don't camp. This is a guess.
Okay, here we go. We got a winner here. Elena said, "Stop feeding it logs." Exactly. If you don't put any more logs on the fire, eventually it'll go out, right? If you keep throwing logs in the fire, how is it supposed to go out? Right? So the thoughts and stories are the logs, and the sensations and feelings is the fire. So what I'm inviting you to do is to imagine yourself at the fire, and you just stay. You just watch the fire, and you don't throw any more logs. That will make the fire go away, because the fire cannot exist without logs. It gets starved, right? And that goes back to what we were talking about, the holding space. If I can hold space for my anxiety, my fatigue, my tension in my shoulders, my sadness, whatever I'm feeling, and I don't create a thought or a story about it, I don't render a mental reference about it, then I'm not really participating in that re-rendering of those sensations. Because they call it a neurosomatic circuit. So it's a neurologically, it means that it's mental, and then somatic means it's body. So it's a circuit. It goes right round. Okay. So the only way to stop those sensations from growing, becoming worse and worse and more chronic, is to not participate in the creation or co-creation of those sensations. Meaning that you just have to attend to sensation. Meaning that you have to be mindful and holding space and allowing of discomfort on its own terms, stripped from any story, stripped from any mental judgment about whether it's good or bad, whether this anxiety or sadness should be here, will be here, whether I like it, whether I don't like it. And going back to that fascination, can I just stay fascinated? Can I just watch this fire, not hate it, not judge it? And if you do that, it will go out, because it doesn't have any more reinforcement. It can't burn just without something, without fuel. Does that make sense? Here's a quote that kind of captures it. When our false perception is corrected, misery ends also. So it's that kind of idea. Except for I wouldn't say that you have to correct the perception. You correct it by not having a judgment at all whatsoever. But that's the idea. Well, our suffering comes from false perception. And so when we remove wrong perception, we remove suffering. And the wrong perception is that of suspicion, hatred, judgment. Those are wrong perceptions. Okay. And then let's move on to another important, this is related to what we're talking about, but it's kind of goes a little bit more in depth about this. So you as a person, there's a million different ways of looking at the self and how it breaks down. But in relation to what we're talking about, this is a very nice way of looking at who you are. At the you could start with at the core, you're a sensational being, right? You know that you exist by virtue of sensation. Like if you, let's say like right now, take your hand and brush it up against your computer. And if you notice the texture of the side of your laptop or whatever, that's a definite feeling. You know you're existing because you experience those sensations. Okay, that's a primary way of existing, is by virtue of being sensational. And mind you, that is probably the most accurate way of determining your existence, is by your immediate. I don't remember, this might be a generational thing, but I grew up watching movies and cartoons where it was, I don't know if you remember this, but they would say, "Oh, pinch me to know if I'm still here," or "Pinch me if you know that I'm dreaming," or something like that. Do you guys know that one? I don't know where it comes from for like movies and stuff like that, but pinch me, right? That's really what that is, right? You only know that you exist because of sensation. Otherwise, you could be dreaming, right? Or you could be somewhere else. All right. So that's sensation. That is your primary way of knowing that you exist. Okay. And then from there, we have the next layer, which is emotion. Now, emotion is related to sensation, but it's one tier away from that kind of definite existence. It is a little bit more elusive, because emotions are almost like waves on an ocean. They kind of come and go, they change. Now, they are reliable. I think it's important to listen to your feelings, listen to your sadness, listen to your anger, because it's important information. But mind you, it's different from listening to your gut, because it's almost like one level away from that definite feeling. So there's a certain sense of like, it's a midway. It's kind of like, it's true and it's also could be misleading. Okay. because you may have a feeling that changes moment to moment. Okay. And then the third tier is the thought. Now, the thought is the least reliable determination of your existence. Thoughts are oftentimes subject to bias, interpretation, prejudice, ignorance, you name it. Thoughts are probably the least reliable source of knowledge of yourself. Of course, but again, they are still useful because at a certain level, you need your thoughts. You need your practical critical thinking skills, your ability to discern information, to do math, to think on your feet. It's not saying it's wrong, but you want to see this as there is some almost like a tier of definity, where sensations is the most definite, emotions is one step away, and thoughts are the most elusive, most aloof, most variable in their presentation. Okay, and so what that says is that we want to rely on our sensations as the primary. We want to get in touch with our sensations. We want to be able to be more connected with our bodies, be more grounded in our bodies, trust our bodies, and then from there, take our emotions into account, somewhat, and then have the most scrutiny with our thoughts. You want to be really discerning of your thoughts because they are often false. Okay, does that make sense? Let me know if you have any feedback for this chart. We're good with this one? All right. So in that case, I'll move on. So this is a little bit of an explanation for this. What I'm inviting you to do is get to know that primary source of connection to yourself, which is the sensation. So it is much easier to hold space for a sensation and feeling than your thought or your story, right? So because if you have like a heaviness in your chest, you know that it's there and you can attend to it. You can put your hand there, you can feel it. Okay, so it's holding space is easier for sensation than it is for thoughts because you can't really hold on to a thought, right? Thoughts are kind of like bubbles that are flying in the air. So holding space for thoughts is kind of impossible, but holding space for feelings and sensations is much more easier. And that goes back to the fire thing, holding space, just being with the fire, not throwing logs. So using the immediate felt sense, we can learn to hold space for uncomfortable feelings and sensations directly without any kind of mental reference or backstory, okay? And as you hold space, you also may notice like micromotor movements or reflexes that are, that signify latent attitudes or undertones of what's happening. Like if you connect to yourself and you're mindful about your anxiety or something, you may notice there's a certain kind of flinch in your face or your body will start to give off little information that is helpful. And remember that your felt sense, your immediate felt sense, is not something that you have or you don't have. It is something that every one of us has to develop and become more familiar with. Okay, it isn't something like, oh, I'm just not in touch with my body. Like, you kind of have to develop it. You have to work at it. You have to like actually take time to get to know it and to feel. And when you first start, it's kind of like it's misty or hazy, and you're like, oh, but my body, I don't know what's down there, whatever. I don't. And so, but that's okay. You know, you have to allow yourself to take the time to become more familiar and in touch with it by just feeling, by being mindful and connecting to noticing. Because that's what emotional intelligence is. You know, it's emotionally unintelligent to only know when you're really, really sad or really, really angry. And by that time, you're already kind of, you know, in a frantic state. So it's an emotional intelligence is to develop an acute sense of like, okay, there's a little bit of sadness there. I could feel it, just a tiny little bit. And being able to know yourself on that level gives you a lot more information to make decisions from a much more subtle place, from a much more well-grounded place than out of a kind of hysteric reactionary place. So that's why developing, knowing yourself better, not mentally, but experientially, it has that benefit. Hold space for yourself. And here's a little quote. I think I might have had this in the previous one, but I kept it. Says, say to your mind, get as depressed as you want. I'm only going to observe you, but I'm not going to join you. And that's the thing. It's like joining is participating in that conversation. You know, joining is continuing to mentally reinforce the depression, whereas allowing and noticing the depression is, it's just like what he's saying. Okay, come on in. I'm not going to give you any judgment. I'm just going to watch. And so in that sense, you don't have to be afraid of your depression. You don't have to be afraid of your uncomfortable feelings, because you're not going to join them. You're just going to allow them to be. And that's the idea. And now I want to turn to a video that I think is going to be really helpful for you guys to watch. It's only a 4-minute video, but it's really powerful. It's by Gabor Mate. And I really encourage you, if you don't know who he is, he's like a modern day, like Carl Jung or somebody, you know, he's really good. I encourage you to check out his books and videos and seminars, okay? So let me go ahead and turn this on.
When the child is born, the child has 2 needs.
Okay. Can you see this? You can see the YouTube? We're good? All right.
No, I can't see the YouTube. I just see the slides.
Okay, let me stop this then. Okay. Now, can you see it?
Yes, we can see it.
Yes.
And you can still see it, right?
Yes.
Okay, all right, here we are. Ready?
When the child is born, the child has 2 needs. The first need is for attachment. And attachment is contact, connection, love. Without that, the human child does not survive. Any mammalian child or even an avian child doesn't survive. So that as soon as you get past the level of reptiles, the reptile is hatched. The mother's long gone by then, and the reptile infant either lives or dies. but there's no attachment to a parenting figure. As soon as you get to the level of birds now, the baby bird has to have an attachment with the parents. The parents have to be attached to the baby. Otherwise, the infant simply does not survive. Mammalians even more so, and most so the human, because we're the least developed, the least mature, with the least developed brains, and the most dependent for the longest period of time of any creature in the universe. So our attachment needs are enormous, and they remain important throughout lifetime because we have to have attachments to form societies, social groups, without which we don't survive. So attachment is a huge need. Be able to connect, belong, be loved by, and love. That's just a basic human need. But we have another need as well, which is for authenticity. Authenticity is the capacity, as I said earlier, to know what we feel, to be in touch with our bodies, and to be able to express who we are and manifest who we are in our activities and in our relationships. Now, why is that? Well, think of a human being in the evolutionary period who's not in touch with their body and their gut feelings. How long do they survive out there in the wild? So authenticity is another huge survival need. Great. So far, so good. But what happens to a child where the attachment need is not compatible with the need for authenticity? In other words, if I'm authentic, my parents will reject me. If I feel what I feel and express what I feel and insist on my own truth, my parents can't handle it. And parents convey those messages unconsciously all the time. Not because they mean to, not because they don't love the child, not because they're not trying to do their best, but because they themselves are suppressed or traumatized or hurt or stressed. So I convey that message many times to my children, believe me, without any conscious desire to do so. In fact, it was the very opposite of what I wished to convey. But that they're not acceptable the way they are, with their emotions the way they are, that's the message my kids got when they were small. And most children get that in our society. Now, what does a child do with that? Well, if I give up my attachment for the sake of authenticity, I lose my relationships on which my life depends. Therefore, there's no question. What becomes suppressed is our authenticity, our emotions. And then we become 25 and 30 or 35, 40, and we don't know who we are. And somebody asks us, what do you feel? You say, I have no idea. And how many times we've all had the experience of having an inkling of a strong gut feeling, but we're ignoring it. We're ignoring it and we get into trouble. Well, that tells us what happened. What happened was that at some point we found out it was too costly for our attachment relationships to be in touch with our gut feelings. So then it becomes our first, not our first nature, but our second nature, to suppress our feelings, to lose touch with ourselves, and to suppress our gut feelings. And then we pay the cost later on in the form of addictions, mental illness, or any range of physical illnesses. But it all began with this tragic conflict that children should never be confronted with, but are all the time, between authenticity on the one hand and attachment on the other. And even as adults, so many people are suffering because they want to be themselves, but they're afraid to be because they know, or at least they fear that if they're themselves, they're going to lose important attachment relationships in their life.
All right. We go back to this. Okay. Any comments about this? Video?
I think I can really relate to this, the video, as far as being authentic to yourself. One of the things, even now as an adult, that I'm working through, even with my counselor, is allowing myself to feel and be, where I am in the moment. I was always a very emotional child. I still cry about, I get excited and I cry about everything. But my mom would always say, what are you crying for? It's nothing to cry about. And so I learned that crying was not good. And so as an adult, I struggled for a very long time to show emotions, and it did lead to having issues with coping with different things because I didn't know how to let myself express my emotions or whatever those were going to be. So I can definitely understand how not being authentic to yourself and allowing yourself to feel and be in those moments, when you're not allowed to do that, how that can hinder you in your life.
Yep. Thanks for sharing that. That's exactly the example, that it's confusing, right? For a child, that basically what we tell our kids, and what we were told as kids, and the overarching story is that don't trust your feelings. You know, your feelings are not to be listened to. Do what I think instead. And so the funny thing is that, like, we in our culture, we have a certain kind of a virtue of self-determination, pick yourself up by your own bootstraps, create your life. But at the same time, it's like, well, how am I supposed to do that if I'm not taught to trust myself? I'm not taught to trust my feelings, my thoughts, my emotions, my gut feelings. Like, so it's confusing. And then we wonder why people have a hard time with their intuition or figuring out what they're supposed to do. Let's see. Tia says, I feel that as we grow into adulthood, these disorders can develop, especially being subject to childhood trauma. How can someone really develop a true identity if they were never allowed to develop one? Exactly. And that's why allowance is such a powerful remedy for this, for ourselves and for others, is that if I can allow my own feelings, if I can learn to be with my own uncomfortable sensations and feelings, and relearn that, or unlearn to resist them, or relearn to allow them, and really develop a guidance system that I naturally have. We all come from with all these faculties of discernment and self-knowledge, but many of us were given confused messages that we shouldn't trust that. I am Native American, so that this is a struggle just due to generational trauma. Yep. Mm-hmm. Then and then you add on all sorts of layers to it with racism and all sorts of war, and it doesn't help, for sure. So yeah, and I'm sorry to hear that. But again, the solution is to learn to allow and find some truth, some benefit to these feelings. However uncomfortable they are, that we don't want to push them away, because that pushes us deeper into this adversarial relationship with ourselves. Oh, why do I have this sadness? Why is this depression here? Why do I feel this way? It's kind of like we're furthering ourselves further and further from what is supposed to be guiding us, right? These feelings are supposed to be there to give us information about what we like, what we don't like, what our preferences are, what resonates, what doesn't resonate, what we need, what we want to get away from, like anger telling you what you don't want to, what you want to get away from, anxieties telling you to be alert, regret and shame is some kind of retrospective self-correction emotion, like, oh, I shouldn't do that anymore. All emotions have some relative benefit. And so when we push them away, we kind of make it much worse. And with our clients too, I invite you to apply this to when you sit with your clients too, because of course, we're all like, I'm pretty sure you guys are mandated, there's all sorts of things like terrace off and suicide mandates and things like that. And of course you have to make the call, but with more subtle things, like if somebody has a certain feeling, a lot of times, therapists are tempted to give advice oh, don't do this, or you should think about that, you know, kind of giving them more, giving them things that they don't know, and then so that further reinforcing that they shouldn't rely on themselves. I'm going to give you, don't trust yourself, trust the authority, trust me. Instead of being, okay, well, you feel a lot of shame right now. Let's just be with that shame. What does the shame need right now? What's happening with this shame? And also not taking responsibility for it, but letting them have their feeling. And I think that's one of the greatest services from this perspective. The greatest service that we can give to ourselves and others is the allowance of our own experiences and feelings. So that's a little contrary to maybe what others might say about it, but. And so that's the allowance. Allowance, we talked about this in previous trainings, but allowance is a versatile state of non-resistance to life and your feelings. And remember, so remember, allowance is so allowing that it can allow resistance even. So no resistance to even resistance itself. You know, it sounds like a Jedi trick, right? But like, for instance, if you're feeling resistance, you can allow the resistance. Oh, I'm feeling really resistant right now. Let me just be with that resistance. So allowance is so versatile that you really, it can be applied into anything. It's kind of like radical acceptance. Radically accepting your feelings. And then this part says that as kids, we are not allowed to be with our emotions. So we have to relearn that as adults in order to return to some kind of divine innocence. And, you know, this sounds kind of, you know, more spiritual or whatever, but I believe that in some way, mental health is really returning to some kind of childlike divine innocence. To return to that kind of joyous place that we kind of had once felt. And I think that's probably the best template that I know for mental health, of a healthy way of being. Okay. So let's move on. Let's move on to boundaries. Now, we talked about boundaries in the first segment, but I want to kind of go deeper into it. So boundaries, sometimes there's a misconception about boundaries because people think boundaries are something that we set for other people. But what I'm inviting you to think about it and remember is that boundaries are something we set for ourselves, not for other people. The reason for that is that if we set boundaries for other people, then we are dependent on them to follow through with the boundary. So for an example, if I tell you, don't raise your voice, and then you raise your voice, and then you say, oh, you crossed my boundary. But it wasn't my boundary. It was a boundary it was more of a request I made of you. So you have to rethink what boundaries are for them to be more effective for you, okay? Because if we need to depend on others to uphold our boundaries, then they're not really boundaries. They're just requests and demands. Yes, Christy says, controlling what you have control over. You can't control anything but yourself, right? And so the way to determine and understand what boundaries are is to start with taking an inventory of what you're available for and what you're not available for. So that's what the best way to look at a boundary is that a list of universal principles that you can maintain in the face of daily adversity. So it's not that you want to. The best way to think about boundaries is not like, oh, I'm going to set a boundary with this person. You want to think about what do I want to be available for, and what kind of experiences I'm not available for, universally, not just with any one specific person. Because of course, if you think to yourself, like for example, you know, I don't want anybody to raise their voice at me. naturally you'd want that to be applied to anybody, right? It's not just one person. You just naturally don't want to be yelled at. Of course, and nobody would be. So the idea is with boundaries is that you have to tell yourself, for instance, if someone raises their voice at me, I will leave the room. That's a boundary that I've decided that I will set for myself, not for anybody else. It's something that I have. It's almost like I had a conversation with myself and I said, hey, Dmitry, listen, if somebody ever raises their voice at you, we're going to leave the room. Do you agree? Yes. Good. All right. Now let's move on. And so then it doesn't matter who it is. Anytime that happens, you leave the room. So now you're no longer dependent on anybody's behavior. You're not trying to make somebody not raise their voice. See, that's the problem. We're tempted to make other people change, but that's a lot more exhausting, because then when they don't, we feel resentful or angry, and we start blaming them, blaming the world. But it's much easier to instead look at our own boundaries and maneuver ourselves in a way that respects our boundaries that we set for ourselves. So if I don't want to hang out with anybody who's an alcoholic, or if I don't want to hang out with anybody who's violent or vulgar, or if I don't want to hang out with anybody who gossips, or whatever it is that I don't like, instead of trying to make them not do that, I just will not participate. And then I can maintain my boundaries. So that's a different definition of a boundary. And I think a lot of people that I talk to really that's not what they think boundaries are. To them, boundaries are requests that they make of other people. Does that make sense? Any questions or any kind of, I don't know, objections to this? Or does anybody not have an issue with, or have a question of how they would do it, or are there situations where that would be difficult to do? I'm sure there are. All right, in that case, I'm just gonna move on. It's the most difficult with my family. Yeah, of course, it's difficult. That's the most difficult thing, because sometimes you're embedded into a situation where you have to maintain proximity with somebody, and I can understand that. But nonetheless, I invite you to keep with this principle, and always ask yourself, okay, what do I need to do right now to take care of myself? This is happening right now. Yeah, this is happening right now, and what do I need to do? What do I need to do for myself to take care of myself in order so that I don't, damage myself or whatever. So it always comes back to that. I really like, for you parents out there, I really I would invite you to look up Love and Logic. Love and Logic Parenting. They have like audio tapes and stuff and books, and they have teens and younger kids, but it's very much in line with this, but they have a very elegant way of dealing with kids, like for instance, kids that are vulgar towards their parents. And one of the ways that they say is, like, for instance, you tell your kid, instead of saying don't raise your voice or stop cursing or whatever, and it's sort of like telling them what to do, but instead they invite the parent to tell the kid what they're gonna do instead. So you might say something like, well, I'd be happy to talk with you as soon as you can speak respectfully. So that way you're kind of conditioning them that I'm only available. I'd be glad to talk with you as soon as you want to talk respectfully with me. So that's a way to, that's kind of a kind way to set a boundary. Instead of telling them what they should do or they should do, you're telling them what you're going to do. I'll be hanging out with you once I can feel comfortable, and that once you can use respectful language. So that's a way to kind of formulate that with kids sometimes, that boundary. Okay. And this is a little bit of I'm not going to go through all this, but basically it says, let me remove this, hide floating control. Okay. So it says, basically those of us who take responsibility and ownership for ourselves will be able to be free to resolve our issues and make changes. As long as we have tried to make others responsible, we will be dependent on them changing before we can change. This is called dependent relationship and enmeshment. Owning is sometimes difficult for us to do, since it requires us to recognize the parts of ourselves for which we have not been owning or taking responsibility. If you take responsibility for your client's successes, you must also take credit for their failures. And this would apply to your people that you help. And also here is and I don't know if I talked about this last time, but it's also important to realize the difference between being responsible and being responsive. Sometimes people can conflate or group the two. They are different. Being responsible, it means that whatever somebody else is feeling or going through, meaning that you caused it, or you are the one, you are the holding, landlord of that, or you're responsible for that. And but the truth is, the only thing you can ever be responsible for is yourself and your behaviors, of course. But we want to learn to be responsive to somebody, but not responsible. So being responsive, it means that we can respond to others or others' needs, desires, situations. We may choose to interact, participate, get involved, or help out of a desire rather than out of responsibility. We can be responsive to others while not being responsible for others. Okay. So that's an important thing when caring for other people or clients or family members or anybody for that matter, is to take a look at what you're responsible for. And that, of course, that goes into codependency and all that kind of stuff, all that good stuff. So, all right, so let me move on. Oh, and here's a really cool quote that I found recently that I really love. And it goes back to this idea of taking responsibility for yourself and not for other people's feelings. It says, no matter how good a person you are evil in someone's story. It's, I think that's such a great thing to remember, because somebody's always going to think, there will always be somebody who doesn't like you or has a certain negative story, or in their minds you're somebody evil or, bad. So like sometimes perhaps it's a reminder that be okay with that. You can't please everybody, and that's what makes people overly responsible for other people's feelings, is that you try to prevent this, right? And you're like, I'm going to make sure that I'm not evil in anyone's story. But that makes you kind of run around and put out fires that you never started. And that the solution is to just give up on trying to prevent that from happening. Somebody is going to not think kindly of you and think that you're a bad person. As long as you know yourself, it's okay. As long as you check out within yourself whether that's true for you, it doesn't matter. Does that make sense? Okay. Let's see here. Let's move on. We have about another half hour. Let's see. I got one more important piece to go through, which is the nonviolent communication piece. And Any questions before we, so that's that. And we're gonna switch gears, and we're gonna go over NVC, nonviolent communication. It's a bit of a long bit, which probably take the rest of the time. Any questions before we start that? You guys are doing all right? Okay. Has anybody ever heard of it, NVC? Well, good. This will be a good introduction. Now, mind you, this is only an introduction. I would recommend, if you like this stuff that I'm about to present, I would recommend going deeper into it, because there's several books that Marshall Rosenberg wrote and stuff that you might want to get into. Okay, cool. Excuse me. So let's get started. Okay, so when we first look at nonviolent communication, it's important to understand what is violent communication. Okay, so first, and one thing to keep in mind, when we talk about nonviolent communication, we're not talking about like physical violence. We're talking about violent communicating. Okay, so first of all, what is violent communication? Communicating in a way that someone gets hurt. Okay, so the first way to understand it is you statements. So anytime that you're talking about somebody else, it's kind of in a certain sense of violent. You didn't, you said, and even positive statements are kind of judgments, like you are awesome. That's, it's not violent, but it is a judgment that you're making about somebody. It's a positive judgment, but it's a judgment. So in this sense, we want to practice kind of moving away from, that. And so language that is, we want to move away from language that is evaluative, judging, interpretive, blaming, or labeling, descriptive. That's violent communication, okay? And the other thing is controlling and demanding languages that force actions. You have to, you should, okay? So shoulding somebody is a violent form of communication, because it kind of superimposes a demand on somebody, and that is inherently violent, okay, from this perspective. Okay, of course, you can kind of make up your own mind about it. So that's that. And characteristics of violent communication is about shifting responsibility for one's needs or feelings to the listener. So it's assuming that your needs, somebody else is responsible for your needs. Okay, and it typically promotes defensiveness in the listener. So, for instance, if I were to tell you should have been there for me last night, like that usually will promote defensiveness in you. You would probably say, "What? Like you're talking about? Like I don't have to be there for you," something of that sort. Okay, so that's the first step, is identifying what is violent communication. Okay. Any questions about it? Does that make sense? Okay, I'm gonna probably move on if there's nothing to be said about that. And I'm open to objections. Like I said, I want you guys to engage in this. If it does something doesn't agree, it's fine too. Okay, I'm gonna move on. I like this quote. It says, "We will become our opposite if we do not learn to accommodate the opposition within us." Okay. So that basically says that a lot of the conflicts that we have with people, sometimes something that we have to really learn to resolve within ourselves first, because we project our problems on other people, or blame our problems on other people. And that's kind of a fancy way to say that. All right. So let's go into nonviolent communication. So the goals for nonviolent or compassionate communication is to express ourselves honestly, a vulnerable sharing of ourselves, and to receive someone else compassionately and empathetically. Okay? And also to appeal to the mutual compassion and empathy for each other. So it kind of creates a closeness with another person rather than causing distance or an alienation. That's what you want, right? You want to be able to connect with people, your family, your friends, your clients. You want to, that's the goal. Okay. Here's another good one. If man doesn't start to work on himself, then the devil will find another job for him to seek for flaws in others. So that's what we want to move away from. Move away from seeking flaws in others. All right, so let's get into nonviolent communication. So NVC has a very neat little acronym that it uses to really get at this formula. So it's OFNR, oftener. So the first part is observation. Okay, so what's important is that to tease out what you observed, what feelings that you have, what need you have, and then how to formulate that need. Okay, so and sometimes when we experience something, we clump it all in one thing. You know, it's the event, the judgment, the feeling, the need, all in one experience. So it's important. That's why this is teased out. So the first part is the observation. Now, an observation is an objective, observable action without interpretation. Okay, I saw, I heard. An example is, you know, I saw you slam the door. Okay, that's all that I know, right? I saw you slam the door. That's an observable fact. Okay, now the next part is the feeling, the disclosing emotional experience. Okay, as I saw that you slam that door, I started to feel scared. Okay, all right, and that's the feeling. And then you can also, the next part is identifying the need. Perhaps I have an underlying need to feel safe, to feel, you know, whatever it is, to feel, yeah, just to feel safe in my home. Okay. And then is the request. Suggestion of a concrete action that we believe will enrich our lives. So, you know, could it be, you know, would it be possible if you didn't slam the door? Okay, so this helps to sort of tease out what's happening, what I'm feeling, what I'm needing, and then making a request. Okay, now this sounds trivial, right? Just saying, oh, why are you doing all this? This is obvious, but it isn't, because a lot of times this stuff can be skipped over. And let's say your partner slams the door, your reaction could be, what the hell, you asshole? Why you got to do that? Now, the process could be the same. Like, you could have feelings of fear, you could have a need for safety, and you want them not to do it. But your immediate reaction maybe is, you know, aggression or name calling, whatever. And that doesn't help. Maybe the person slammed the door on accident. Maybe it was the wind that maybe there was a window open that made it happen more so than they had planned. And so you see how our reaction and our unchecked, our inability to inquire about what we're feeling or what we're needing can really make the situation worse, create a dynamic in the relationship that is violent, name calling, blaming. Says here, Michelle, back in the late 70s, the push on healthy communication was to make when you, I feel statements. This looks like an expanded update to that. Yeah, right. And yeah, and it is, and that's true. And there's been some pitfalls along the way that we've experienced in the sort of psychological community that have been efforts to co-opt this, and that's why there's been efforts to refine it, because people would start to try to do things like, oh, I feel like you're a jerk, which is really a sneaky way to use I statements to try to still make judgments about other people. And so that's why it has been updated a bit. So yeah, so that's the acronym to use, and I'll be these slides I provided already, so you guys can use this just on this PDF we'll provide if you want to remember this. So that's that part. And this is a little thing I posted on my Instagram. It says, Zen is not about getting rid of preferences. It's about allowing them not to be met. So the idea is you can make requests, but it doesn't mean that the person is going to meet that request. And if they say no, then you're going to have to figure out what you want to do about getting your need met. Because people are not need-fulfilling machines. They're not responsible for meeting our needs. And sometimes that means that we have to go just to ask somebody else for help, or not be around this person anymore if they don't. Like if I tell my partner, oh, please, could you not slam doors? You know, it really bothers me, and I feel scared, and I have this need for safety. And then they say, no, I'm not. I'm going to keep slamming doors. Then I may have to be like, well, maybe I can't live here anymore. You know, if they're not able to meet my need, I'm going to have to figure out what I need to do about them. So let's see. Here's another important thing about this sequence that you have to understand. So it goes like this. It goes action, belief, and then the feeling, okay? So here's how it works. Somebody does an objective action. So for instance, let's go back to the door slamming thing. Let's say someone does an objective action. Somebody slams a door, okay? Then after that, a lot of times I have a belief, thoughts, meanings, interpretations of that action and how it affects my needs. So for instance, if my partner slammed the door and I have a belief that they're angry or they're upset with me, I will generate a feeling that's related to that. So if you slam the door and I think, oh, they're just pissed at me, then my feeling might be like, oh, well, I'm pissed at them too, or I'm scared of them, or whatever that feeling is, okay? That's important, because if they slam the door and I have a belief that it was an accident, my feeling will be different. Maybe I might get annoyed, or I might not think much of it. You see? So it's not the action that makes you feel something, it's the belief about the action. What you believe about the action and what the person's intention is. Like when you come home and the dishes aren't done. If you believe that they don't care about you, you're going to be pissed, right? Oh, you don't give a shit you don't care about me. I come home, nothing is done. So you may have a belief that your partner doesn't care about you. Now, if you come home and the dishes aren't done and you have a belief that, oh, maybe my partner's tired, maybe they had a long day at work and they're just taking self-care right now and they're not able to do dishes, I'll have a different feeling. I'll maybe feel like, oh, sense of compassion and understanding. So the same event can happen, but your belief about that event changes how you feel. And that's why it's important to take a moment and ask yourself, what do I believe about this observable event that I just witnessed? And then that's why it's important to check that belief out. Ask the person sometimes. Like for instance, if your partner slammed the door, ask them, are you upset with me? And they might say, well, why do you think that? Well, you slammed the door. Oh, that was an accident. Okay. So then that belief is scratched. It's no longer. But if you don't ask and you just assume, then there may be consequential behaviors and feelings on your end as a result. That's the consequence. Okay. So your feeling is not about, so your feeling is about the belief, not about the action. The feeling is from your belief that your needs won't be met and are threatened. So it's always about a fundamental need that's there that you're not in touch with. It's usually a need for safety, a need for connection, a need for something, a need for care that you think is threatened, and that's why you generate these feelings. And so feelings are always valid, but the link between the feelings and the action is not always valid. All right, so this part is a little complicated, so I want to make sure that you guys, is there any questions about this? Does this make sense? Nice, I'm glad, Courtney. And another thing is to remember, we talked about ownership of feelings, and I think in the first series, is that you also have to own that, oh, you may even try telling your partner, like, oh, I have a story that you're upset with me right now, or I have a belief that you don't like me right now, or and it's like you have to almost start to own, like, oh, like that's my story, that I'm creating that, and not to as what they call splain, right? So splaining is when you're certain that's what they're feeling. I know you hate me. I know you don't like me, or I know that you don't care about me. It's like, and that's where you get into real trouble, when you assert that about how someone else is feeling, and instead of actually getting to know how you're feeling, you escape from that inquiry and you go into a judgment about how you think your partner is feeling. So going back to, and this all is related back to knowing how you feel, attending to what you're feeling, attending to your own needs, attending to what your beliefs are about the situation, being open about it, will really lead you to change your dynamics that you have with your relationships, with your people that you love. And then also some pitfalls to avoid. Using passive tense verbs. So I feel abused by you when you talk that way. Accusations that they have done that verb, cause, made. You made me feel sad. That there's a certain kind of preemptive accusation. Instead of saying, well, as I saw you do that, I had this belief that you don't like me, and then I felt kind of sad. I reacted with some sadness. See, that's ownership. I reacted. As I saw you do that, I reacted with some sadness and that I'm feeling, because I have this belief that you don't like me, or that you're pissed, or you're angry with me. See, that's healthier than you made me sad, because really no one can make you feel anything. That's the idea. And so language of that kind is also a pitfall. And again, the same one is here. I'm angry because you. Instead of saying I reacted with anger, or I'm making myself angry, or I'm angering myself right now as I see you do that. That's healthier than I'm angry because you made me feel angry. You made me angry. You made me punch a hole in the wall, which is the extreme case. And that's when it's totally disowned, right? It's a signs blame. Okay? Yep.
How would you rephrase these? Can you repeat how you would rephrase these so that they're not like accusatory?
What would be helpful if you gave me an observable event then I could just do it with that.
Somebody does something like at work, or a coworker does something at work, and it makes like it irritates me or it makes me angry.
Well, give me the observable fact. What, like, make up a thing that they did, like that you can see.
You stepped into a situation that I was handling and completely took everything over.
Okay. So you might say, let's say you're the person that did that. Hey, Courtney, when I saw you step into that situation and start to involve yourself with this case, I had this belief that perhaps you don't care about me, and I felt kind of unsupported, and that made me, and that didn't make me. I'm reacting with a bit of anger about that. And I'm trying to understand, what happened. And then you might ask, is it true that, was that your intention to, whatever it is that you did, But the idea is you want to tease out that part where you're not, you're basically, you're leaving room for error. You're saying, hey, I want to be proven wrong. Like I could be wrong about this. Like, when you stepped in like that, I had this belief that perhaps you don't like me, or that that you don't want to support me, I'm starting to react with a bit of sadness and anger about it. But the idea is I want to own that I'm having this reaction, that that it's me, it's my anger, I'm having it. You're not making me have that. Does that make sense?
Yes. So what I got was when you did XYZ.
When I saw you do that. Mm-hmm.
I'm a formula person. I had the belief that XYZ, I reacted with, was it your intention to?
Right.
Okay. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, and sorry if I'm making a little snaggy corrections. It's the reason why I would say when I saw you do that is because people could see it differently from different angles. And so you also want to own that that's how you saw it. You know what I mean?
Okay, I understand that. Thank you.
Because you say when you did, then you kind of ultimately stamp that that's exactly how it happened. So when you explain what you saw, you want to own that that was me observing with my eyes. But yeah, you had it good. That's exactly how I would handle it. So that's pretty much it. I want to leave a couple minutes for questions. This last quote is, "Life always offers you a second chance. It's called tomorrow." And that's it for today's training. That was awesome. Thank you so much. I can answer some questions still if I can linger around for a couple more minutes. If anybody has any last comments or ideas or anything. Thank you, Allison.
You had a website up at the beginning of the slideshow. Can you show that again or repeat what that website is?
I'll just type it in. Spiralprocess.com, one word.
Do you mind if I jump in real quick, Dmitry, just to promote the feedback survey before you answer any more questions? In the chat box, I'll drop it again as folks are showing love to Dmitry for the great job he did today. If you could please complete the training survey. It's really brief. It helps us to tailor and improve training moving forward. So I'll step aside in case there are more questions for Dmitry.
Thank you, Mark.